Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. The Whitmore family lived in a large stucco home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Seabrook Isles, an upscale neighborhood just outside Charleston, South Carolina. The streets were lined with palm trees and trimmed hedges. On summer evenings, children rode bikes in lazy circles while parents chatted at the edge of manicured lawns. It was the kind of place where front doors were rarely locked during daylight and neighbors waved as they passed. From the outside, Claire Whitmore's life looked carefully assembled and enviable. She was 37 in the summer of 2016, polished but approachable, the kind of woman who could host a dinner party for 20 and still remember which guest preferred sparkling water over wine. Her husband, Daniel Whitmore, worked in commercial real estate. He was athletic, outgoing, and known for coaching their son's youth soccer team. Their two children, 8-year-old Carter and 5-year-old Eliza, were fixtures in the neighborhood, racing scooters down the cul-de-sac while Daniel cheered them on. To anyone watching, they were thriving. The Whitmores hosted holiday cookouts, birthday parties, and neighborhood cocktail nights. Claire's friends described her as warm and loyal. Daniel was seen as driven and protective of his family. Even when rumors began to circulate that the marriage was strained, the couple managed appearances with impressive discipline. They attended school events together. They posed for photos at neighborhood gatherings. If there were cracks, they did not show them publicly. But by the spring of 2016, the marriage was unraveling. The arguments had grown sharper, more frequent. Daniel's temper, once described as passionate, had turned volatile. Claire confided in only a few people, careful not to damage Daniel's reputation. She spoke cautiously about his jealousy, about the way disagreements escalated. She insisted that things were complicated, not dangerous. In June, she asked for a separation. Daniel moved into a townhouse 15 minutes away. The split was described to friends as amicable, focused on co-parenting. They told neighbors they were working through details respectfully. In reality, the separation was tense. There were heated exchanges about finances, about custody schedules, about who had wronged whom. Around that same time, Claire's professional life offered an unexpected shift. She worked as a regional marketing director for a national athletic apparel company headquartered in Charleston. The role required collaboration with senior executives and frequent meetings. One of those executives was Marcus Hale. Marcus was disciplined, deliberate, and self-assured. A graduate of a military academy and a former intelligence officer, he had transitioned into corporate leadership with a reputation for strategic thinking. He carried himself with quiet authority. People listened when he spoke. Claire first interacted with him in April during a project rollout. Their relationship was strictly professional at the start. Meetings, strategy sessions, occasional emails exchanged late in the evening about campaign metrics. But as her marriage deteriorated, Marcus became someone she trusted. He listened without judgment. He asked thoughtful questions. When she mentioned feeling overwhelmed, he offered practical advice instead of platitudes. By early summer, their connection deepened. After Claire and Daniel officially separated in June, she and Marcus began seeing each other socially. What started as shared lunches turned into dinners. Dinners became evenings spent talking long after restaurants had closed. By July, the relationship was intimate. Claire moved carefully. She did not want to introduce instability into her children's lives. Marcus understood. He did not pressure her. Their relationship, while discreet, became serious quickly. He offered what she felt had been missing for years: steadiness. Daniel, however, did not accept the new reality. Though he had started dating casually himself, he remained fixated on Claire's life. He drove past the Seabrook Isles home more often than necessary. He asked mutual friends questions about who had been visiting. When he learned through a neighbor that a man had been seen helping Claire with yard work, something shifted. The texts began. At first, they were pleading. "I miss our family. We can fix this. I know I messed up." Then the tone darkened. "Who is he? Don't embarrass me in front of the kids. You think people don't notice?" Claire tried to respond calmly. She insisted there was no boyfriend. She said Marcus was simply helping with household tasks. She attempted to de-escalate. Daniel's messages grew more pointed. "If he's not hiding, why doesn't he park in the driveway? I will talk to him, face to face." Claire felt the tension tightening, but believed she could manage it. She filed for a protective order after Daniel showed up unannounced one night and refused to leave the driveway. The court granted a temporary injunction restricting him from approaching her home without notice. Daniel violated it within weeks by entering the property while Claire was out of town. He took several of her personal belongings and left them piled in the backyard. The items were later burned. Despite this, Daniel maintained composure in public. At court appearances, he appeared calm and articulate. He denied being unstable. He denied threats. He described himself as heartbroken but rational. On the morning of August 12, 2016, Claire returned home from dropping her children off at a neighbor's house for a playdate. It was just after 9 o'clock. The sky was bright and cloudless. The neighborhood was quiet. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. At first, she thought she had walked into the wrong house. Drawers were pulled out and overturned. Cushions were slashed. Papers littered the floor like confetti. Picture frames had been knocked from the walls. Her television screen was shattered. Closet doors hung open, clothing dragged out and scattered. Nothing obvious was missing. The destruction felt purposeful, invasive, as if someone had searched every inch. Her breath shortened. She moved cautiously through the living room, then upstairs. The master bedroom was worse. Dresser drawers emptied, dresser drawers dumped, mattresses pushed aside. Claire stepped back into the hallway and pulled out her phone. She called her closest friend, Melissa Grant. Melissa and Claire had met years earlier through mutual friends. Along with another friend, Dana Brooks, the three women had formed a tight circle. They shared babysitting duties, late-night conversations, and unfiltered honesty. Melissa answered on the second ring. "There's something wrong. The house, it's destroyed." Melissa didn't hesitate. She told Claire to stay outside and said she was coming over. She texted Dana immediately. Claire also called Marcus. He answered quickly. She switched to video so he could see the damage. He watched silently as she walked through the wreckage, her hand shaking slightly. "I'm on my way," he said. Within 30 minutes, Melissa and Dana arrived. Marcus followed soon after. The four of them stood in the living room surveying the destruction. No one spoke at first. Melissa whispered, "This wasn't random." Marcus nodded. He moved toward the garage to check for forced entry. He was methodical, scanning for signs of how someone had gotten inside. Claire felt an unease she couldn't name. The house was damaged, yes, but something about the absence of theft suggested something else. Someone had been looking for proof. Upstairs, Claire and Dana tried to piece together what had been disturbed. Melissa followed Marcus into the garage to inspect a side door that appeared slightly misaligned. None of them knew that less than an hour earlier, Daniel Whitmore had stood in that very bedroom, turning over drawers, searching for evidence that his wife had moved on without him. And none of them knew that the morning was far from over. The four of them were still inside the house when the first gunshot shattered the morning calm. Marcus had just stepped back into the kitchen from the garage when a loud crack echoed through the living room. For a split second, no one moved. The sound didn't register as gunfire at first. It was too sharp, too sudden, like something heavy slamming against glass. Then the second shot came. The front window exploded inward. Shards of glass sprayed across the hardwood floor. Claire screamed. Marcus didn't hesitate this time. "Get down!" he shouted. Melissa dropped to her knees behind the kitchen island. Dana froze near the base of the staircase. Claire stood rooted in place, staring toward the shattered window as another bullet tore through the wall behind her. Outside, in the backyard, Daniel Whitmore stood with a handgun raised in both hands. He wasn't pacing, he wasn't shouting randomly. He was focused. His eyes scanned the house as he fired again, this time aiming higher toward the second-story windows. "Where is he?" Daniel yelled. "Where is he?" Marcus understood immediately. He was the target. Adrenaline surged. He grabbed Claire's arm. "Upstairs, now!" They bolted for the staircase as another shot rang out. Wood splintered from the banister inches from Melissa's shoulder. Dana scrambled behind them, nearly slipping on broken glass. Marcus reached the top first. He pushed Claire toward the master bedroom. "Lock it!" But before they could shut themselves inside, the front door downstairs crashed open. The sound of heavy footsteps thundered across the foyer. Daniel was inside. Claire's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She looked at Marcus, terror overtaking the composure she had tried to maintain for months. "You need to leave," she whispered urgently. Marcus hesitated. Another set of footsteps hit the stairs. There was no time. "I'll draw him away," Marcus said. "Go!" He turned and sprinted down the hallway toward the guest bedroom at the far end, hoping to reach the back balcony. Claire grabbed Dana and pulled her into the master suite instead. Melissa followed, slamming the bedroom door behind them. Claire locked it. The footsteps grew louder. Daniel's voice carried up the stairwell, wild and furious. "Where is he? Claire!" Marcus reached the guest room and shoved open the sliding glass door. He vaulted onto the balcony, barely pausing before climbing over the railing and dropping to the ground below. The impact sent pain shooting up his legs, but he didn't stop. He ran between houses, cutting across lawns toward the street. Behind him, another gunshot cracked through the air. Inside the master bedroom, Claire shoved Dana and Melissa toward the walk-in closet. "Get in there," she said. They stumbled inside. Claire pulled the closet door closed just as Daniel reached the bedroom. The door slammed open so hard it hit the wall. Daniel stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, gun still in his hand. His face was flushed, eyes blazing with something beyond anger. "Where is he?" he demanded. Claire stood near the bathroom entrance, hands trembling but raised slightly as if trying to calm a wild animal. "He's not here," Daniel cried. "Please, the kids." "Don't lie to me," he shouted. From inside the closet, Melissa pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Dana crouched behind a stack of storage boxes, shaking uncontrollably. Through the thin wood of the closet door, they could hear everything. Daniel stepped closer to Claire. "You think I don't know? You think I don't see what you're doing?" Claire's voice cracked. "This isn't helping anything. Please put the gun down." There was a loud bang. Melissa flinched, unsure whether it was another shot or something knocked over. Then Claire cried out. The sound that followed was one Melissa would later describe as something she could never forget, a choked, startled gasp. Inside the closet, Dana whispered, "Call 911. Melissa fumbled for her phone with shaking hands. She dialed and pressed it to her ear, speaking in a whisper. "There's a man in the house with a gun. He's shooting. Please." Outside, Marcus had reached a neighbor's yard. He pounded on the door, shouting for someone to call the police. Within minutes, multiple 911 calls flooded the dispatch center. Upstairs, Daniel turned toward the closet. "Open the door," he ordered. Melissa braced herself against it, pressing her foot firmly against the base and gripping the knob. Dana crouched lower, phone still in her hand with the operator on the line. "Sir, officers are on the way," the dispatcher said faintly through the speaker. Daniel pounded on the door. "Open it!" When no one responded, he fired. The bullet tore through the wood, splintering the panel inches from Melissa's shoulder. She screamed and stumbled backward, her arm burning where debris grazed her skin. Daniel kicked the door. It burst inward. For a split second, he looked at Melissa, then his gaze shifted past her to Dana. Melissa would later say that in that moment, she realized she was not the one he wanted. Daniel stepped into the closet. Melissa used the opening. She darted past him, sprinting down the hallway and down the stairs, her heart pounding so violently she could hear it in her ears. She didn't look back. Behind her, another shot echoed through the house. By the time police vehicles screeched into Seabrook Isles, Daniel was gone. He had left the house through the back door, moving quickly toward a car parked 2 streets over. He drove away before the first cruiser turned onto Claire's road. Inside the home, officers found a scene of devastation. Claire Whitmore lay in the master bathroom doorway. Dana Brooks was inside the closet. Both had sustained multiple gunshot wounds. Melissa, bleeding from her arm, was found wandering barefoot near the end of the cul-de-sac, hysterical but alive. Marcus returned minutes later, shaken but physically unharmed. Paramedics worked frantically, but it was clear almost immediately that Claire and Dana had not survived. The quiet, manicured neighborhood had transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the Whitmore driveway. News vans began arriving before noon. Neighbors stood in clusters at the edges of lawns, stunned and whispering. Daniel Whitmore was nowhere to be found. Authorities issued a statewide alert. He was considered armed and extremely dangerous. Surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras showed his vehicle heading north, away from Charleston. By late afternoon, law enforcement learned that Daniel had stopped at a gas station 40 miles away. He appeared calm in the footage, purchasing fuel and snacks as if it were any other day. Phone records revealed he had called his father shortly before the shooting. Witnesses later described hearing raised voices, a plea to come back and think about the kids. But Daniel had not turned back. Instead, he had driven with purpose. And as the sun set over Seabrook Isles, 2 families were shattered and a manhunt stretched across state lines. The manhunt for Daniel Whitmore intensified overnight. By early evening, law enforcement agencies across South Carolina and into North Carolina had been alerted. His vehicle description was circulated to state patrol units. Officers monitored highway cameras and toll data. The working assumption was clear. Daniel was not done running, and he was still armed. Around 10:30 p.m., nearly 9 hours after the shooting, a 911 call came in from a rural stretch of highway outside Asheville, North Carolina. A woman driving home with her 2 young children reported that a dark SUV had aggressively tailgated her, then swerved in front of her vehicle, forcing her to brake hard. She described the driver as erratic and agitated. She said he briefly stepped out of the SUV at a stoplight before getting back in and speeding away. The description matched Daniel's vehicle. Within 30 minutes, North Carolina State Highway Patrol located the SUV parked at a roadside convenience store. Officers approached cautiously, weapons drawn. Daniel was inside the vehicle alone. He did not resist. 2 handguns were recovered from the passenger seat, a 9mm and a .45 caliber. Both were later confirmed to match shell casings found inside Claire's home. Daniel was taken into custody without incident. Back in Charleston, the reality of what had happened began settling in. Claire Whitmore, a mother of 2, and Dana Brooks, a mother of 3, were gone. Melissa Grant, wounded but alive, was hospitalized for treatment and shock. Marcus Hale, the man Daniel had been searching for, gave a detailed statement to investigators, describing the morning's events from the moment Claire called him. The children were shielded from the details, but they could not be shielded from the loss. Funerals were held within a week. At Claire's service, the church overflowed. Friends spoke about her generosity, her loyalty, her quiet resilience. Photos of Carter and Eliza with their mother were placed near the altar. There were no easy words to explain why their lives had been upended. Dana's husband delivered a eulogy that was steady but visibly strained. He spoke about school recitals she would miss, about the empty chair that would sit at future birthdays, about the ordinary moments that now felt irreplaceable. The community that once admired the Whitmores as a model family now grappled with a darker truth. Violence had been growing beneath the surface. Daniel was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder for Melissa's injury, armed burglary, aggravated stalking, and multiple firearms offenses. Prosecutors announced early that they would seek the maximum penalty allowed under state law. In the months that followed, investigators pieced together a timeline that revealed premeditation. Cell phone records showed that Daniel had driven past Claire's home multiple times in the days leading up to the attack. He had searched online for information about restraining orders and custody modifications. He had purchased ammunition 2 weeks earlier. On the morning of the attack, he attended a brief court hearing related to violating the protective order. Witnesses described him as composed and articulate. He denied being unstable or under the influence of any substances. Less than an hour after leaving the courthouse, he broke into Claire's home. Forensic evidence suggested he had entered through a side garage door before dawn. He spent several hours inside, moving through the house, opening drawers, examining personal items. The destruction Claire discovered was not random vandalism, it was targeted. He had focused heavily on the master bedroom and bathroom. Investigators believed he had been searching for confirmation of her relationship with Marcus. When Claire called him later that morning to confront him about the damage, their phone records show a 12-minute conversation. The content of that call was never fully disclosed, but prosecutors argued it was the final trigger. At trial, the defense attempted to argue diminished capacity. They introduced testimony from a psychiatrist who suggested Daniel had been suffering from severe emotional distress and possible parasomnia, a sleep-related disorder that can involve abnormal behavior. The prosecution dismantled that theory quickly. Surveillance footage, fuel purchases, calculated travel routes, and the coordinated use of 2 firearms demonstrated clarity and intent. Daniel's actions before and after the shooting reflected planning, not confusion. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony from Melissa Grant. She described Daniel's expression when he entered the master bedroom. He knew what he was doing, she told the jury. He wasn't lost, he wasn't confused, he was looking for someone. Marcus testified as well. He admitted his relationship with Claire. He described fleeing the home because he believed Daniel intended to kill him. "I thought if I stayed," he said quietly, "everyone would die." The courtroom was often silent during testimony. Daniel sat rigidly at the defense table, rarely making eye contact with anyone. His family, including his sister, attended regularly. They maintained that he had been overwhelmed by betrayal and emotional strain. They asked the jury to consider his upbringing, including exposure to domestic violence as a child. Prosecutors acknowledged his background, but emphasized accountability. "Many people endure hardship," the lead prosecutor said during closing arguments. "They do not arm themselves, break into homes, and execute 2 women." The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts. During the penalty phase, victim impact statements filled the courtroom. Dana's husband described coaching Little League alone. He spoke about explaining to his youngest child why Mommy wasn't coming home. Claire's parents talked about the final phone call they had shared with their daughter days before her death. Melissa, still carrying faint scars on her arm, described living with recurring nightmares. When given the opportunity to speak, Daniel offered a brief statement. He apologized to his children. He did not directly address the families of Claire or Dana. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the related offenses. The court cited the calculated nature of the crimes and the presence of multiple aggravating factors. Daniel Whitmore was transferred to a maximum security state prison within the month. In Seabrook Isles, the Whitmore home was eventually sold. New owners repainted the walls and replaced the shattered windows. From the outside, the house once again looked peaceful. But for those who lived through that August morning, the illusion of safety had permanently shifted. The case became a reference point in discussions about domestic violence and escalation. Advocates pointed to the pattern of warning signs: obsessive communication, violation of protective orders, property destruction, explicit threats. Experts emphasized that separation is statistically one of the most dangerous periods in an abusive relationship. Claire had sought legal protection. She had leaned on friends. She had tried to manage the situation with composure. None of that erased the risk posed by someone unwilling to relinquish control. Carter and Eliza were raised primarily by Claire's parents. Dana's children grew up surrounded by extended family determined to preserve her memory. Annual charity runs were organized in both women's names, raising funds for domestic violence prevention programs in Charleston County. Years later, neighbors still remembered the sound of gunshots cutting through an otherwise ordinary morning. They remembered how quickly a familiar life had fractured. The story of the Whitmore case was not simply about jealousy or a failed marriage. It was about escalation, about how resentment, when paired with entitlement and access to weapons, can become lethal. And it was about the lives that continue after violence. Children who grow up carrying stories they never chose. Friends who replay moments, wondering what might have changed the outcome. In the end, Daniel Whitmore's sentence closed the legal chapter. But for the families left behind, accountability did not equal healing. It only marked the boundary between what had happened and the long process of living with it. On the surface, Briarwood looked like the kind of town that framed its own reflection in gold. It sat between low rolling hills and a slow river that carried fallen leaves like secrets drifting downstream. Parents waved at each other in the mornings, teachers were respected, front doors were sometimes left unlocked. Nothing truly bad was supposed to happen in Briarwood. That illusion shattered on a gray Thursday in October. It began with a locked classroom door. Maple Grove Elementary stood at the edge of town, red brick softened by decades of ivy. Room 12 belonged to Mr. Daniel Harlow, a fifth-grade teacher who had transferred from Cedar Ridge the previous year. He was well-liked, organized, and known for his calm demeanor. Parents described him as attentive. Students said he was strict but fair. That morning, the hallway outside Room 12 was unusually quiet. At 8:17 a.m., Assistant Principal Marla Green noticed something small but unsettling. Harlow's classroom lights were on, but the door was closed and locked from the inside. That alone wasn't unheard of. Teachers often arrived early, but the blinds were drawn halfway down and there was no movement inside. Marla knocked. No answer. She tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. A custodian fetched a master key. When the door finally opened, the room looked normal at first glance. Desks aligned, homework stacked neatly. The whiteboard displayed the day's agenda, written in Harlow's tidy block letters: fractions review, science lab prep, parent forms due Friday. But Daniel Harlow was not there, and neither was one of his students. 11-year-old Callie Mercer's backpack sat beneath her desk. Her lunchbox remained unopened. Her jacket hung neatly on the back of her chair. Callie herself was gone. Within minutes, the school shifted from routine to crisis. The remaining students in Room 12 had not yet arrived. Harlow had been scheduled for morning bus duty at 7:40, but no one remembered seeing him outside. Callie's bus driver insisted she had boarded like usual. By 9:02 a.m., the Briarwood Police Department had sealed off the building. Detective Morales stepped into Room 12 at 9:38 a.m., scanning the space with deliberate patience. She was not easily rattled. 15 years in law enforcement had taught her that panic clouds perception. She believed in quiet details. There were details here. Harlow's desk drawer was slightly ajar. Inside were standard supplies, except one thing stood out. His phone was missing. His laptop remained plugged in, screen dark. A ceramic mug half filled with cold coffee sat beside it. Morales crouched near Callie's desk. The backpack contained textbooks, a binder, and a crumpled permission slip. No signs of struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken glass, yet something felt wrong. "Check security footage," she said calmly. Maple Grove had installed hallway cameras 2 years earlier after minor vandalism incidents. The footage showed Harlow entering the building at 7:58 a.m. alone. He appeared composed, carrying his usual satchel. At 7:12 a.m., Callie entered through the side entrance. She walked directly toward room 12. At 7:14 a.m., the hallway camera captured Harlow opening his classroom door from inside. He let Callie in. The door closed. No one else entered. No one exited. After that, the hallway remained empty. Morales watched the clip 3 times. "Is there another exit?" she asked. The custodian nodded reluctantly. "There's a secondary fire door at the back of the classroom, leads outside to the service lane. Alarm only triggers if it's opened fully." They rushed outside. The back lane was gravel and bordered by a chain-link fence. Tire tracks crisscrossed the surface from maintenance vehicles. But near the fire door, Morales noticed something different. The gravel was disturbed in a narrow path leading toward the street. Not fresh footprints exactly, but a disruption that didn't match the surrounding ground. The fire door showed no signs of forced entry. The alarm system indicated it had been opened at 7:19 a.m. and closed within 10 seconds. 10 seconds. That was all it took. By noon, Briarwood buzzed with rumors. Parents lined up outside the police perimeter tape. News vans arrived. The Mercer family stood pale and shaking near the principal's office, holding on to hope like it was fragile glass. Detective Morales did not believe in coincidence. She requested Harlow's employment records. Clean background check, strong references from Cedar Ridge, no complaints on file. But when officers contacted Cedar Ridge Middle School for informal insight, a former colleague hesitated. "There were concerns," the colleague admitted. "Nothing official, just parents who felt he was overly invested in certain students, always offering extra tutoring, staying late. No documented misconduct." Still, Morales wrote it down. By late afternoon, the investigation took a sharper turn. A vehicle matching Harlow's silver sedan was captured on a traffic camera heading south out of Briarwood at 7:27 a.m., 8 minutes after the fire door alarm. The plate matched. The direction led toward Pine Hollow, a wooded rural stretch 20 miles away. Search units were dispatched immediately. Meanwhile, Morales interviewed students from room 12 who had arrived after 7:30. One boy mentioned something small but troubling. "Mr. Harlow told us yesterday that he might start a before-school math club," the boy said nervously. "He said some of us could come early if we wanted extra help." Callie had struggled in math. Her parent confirmed she had mentioned getting additional help, but there had been no permission slip, no announcement from the administration, just a quiet invitation. At 5:42 p.m., officers located Harlow's silver sedan parked at the edge of Pine Hollow's old logging trail. The car was locked. Inside were his satchel, a folded blanket, and a half-empty water bottle. Callie was not inside. Harlow was nowhere in sight. The woods were dense and stretched for miles. Search teams combed the area as daylight faded. Dogs picked up a faint scent leading deeper into the forest, but lost it near a creek crossing. Morales stood at the tree line as darkness settled. Something about the timing bothered her. The alarm triggered at 7:19. The car passed the traffic camera at 7:27. That gave him 8 minutes to exit the classroom, reach the service lane, place Callie in the vehicle, and leave school grounds without being seen. It was possible, but it required planning. This was not impulsive. Back in Briarwood, the community fractured into disbelief and anger. Social media ignited with speculation. Some insisted Harlow must have been framed. Others demanded immediate arrest warrants. Morales remained focused on evidence. Forensics returned preliminary findings from room 12 late that night. Trace fibers near the fire door matched the interior of Harlow's car interior. A partial shoe print outside corresponded to the brand he wore regularly. Then came something more chilling. Hidden in Harlow's locked filing cabinet was a small notebook. It contained handwritten observations about several students, notes about behavior patterns, emotional vulnerabilities, academic struggles. Callie's name appeared multiple times. There were entries about her parents' recent divorce, her tendency to arrive early, her difficulty with fractions, and one line written 2 days ago. Opportunity window narrowing. Must act before attention shifts. Morales stared at the page in silence. This was no misunderstanding. This was preparation. At 12:16 p.m., a deputy radioed from Pine Hollow. They had found something near the creek. A child's sneaker, pink with silver stars. Callie's mother confirmed the brand through tears. The search intensified overnight under portable floodlights. Detective Morales knew the case had crossed into darker territory. The missing teacher was no longer just a suspect, he was a fugitive, and Briarwood's illusion of safety had been irreparably damaged. But the forest was wide, and Daniel Harlow was still out there. As midnight approached, Morales made a decision. She requested financial records. If Harlow had planned this, he might have prepared beyond the classroom. At 12:38 a.m., the first report came in. 3 days before the disappearance, Harlow had withdrawn $8,000 in cash from his bank. The amount was too specific to ignore. Briarwood was not dealing with panic. They were dealing with design. And somewhere beyond the tree line, under the weight of dark branches and silent earth, a plan was still unfolding. The morning after the incident, Alder Ridge felt like a town that had woken from a bad dream and wasn't sure whether it had truly happened. The police tape still fluttered across the front doors of West Hollow Middle School, snapping lightly in the early breeze as though it were the only thing brave enough to speak. Parents clustered along the sidewalks, their voices low and tight. News vans lined the curb, satellite dishes pointed skyward like silent witnesses. And somewhere behind the locked glass doors, investigators continued to move in careful, deliberate steps. Detective Lena Carr arrived just after sunrise. She stepped out of her unmarked sedan and surveyed the scene with the measured calm of someone who had learned long ago not to trust first impressions. Alder Ridge was small, but it wasn't naive. It had secrets like any other place. They just rarely surfaced this violently. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and something metallic that no amount of cleaning would ever quite erase from memory. The 8th grade science classroom remained sealed off. Technicians worked around the perimeter, photographing everything twice. The whiteboard still displayed a half-finished diagram of the solar system. Saturn's rings were drawn with meticulous care. Mr. Calvin Mercer's desk had been emptied into evidence bags overnight. Files, a flash drive, handwritten notes. One of the officers handed Carr preliminary inventory. "Anything jump out?" she asked. "Not yet, but we found this." He held up a small spiral notebook recovered from the back cabinet. Carr flipped through it. At first glance, it looked like standard lesson planning, dates, homework reminders, but tucked between routine entries were short, cryptic lines. Told her not to say anything. If they find out, it's over. Carr's jaw tightened slightly. Context mattered, so did timing. The victim, 8th grader Rowan Hale, had been found unresponsive near the lab tables the afternoon before. Initial reports suggested trauma, but the coroner would need more time. What made the situation volatile was Mercer's behavior. According to multiple staff members, he had been the last adult alone with Rowan. By mid-morning, Carr was seated across from Principal Marjorie Dunning in the administrative office. Dunning looked as though she had aged a decade overnight. "Calvin has worked here 14 years, Dunning said quietly. "No complaints, excellent evaluations. Students adored him." Adored is a strong word, Carr replied gently. Did anyone ever express concerns, even minor ones? Dunning hesitated. There were rumors last semester, nothing formal. A few parents mentioned that he singled certain students out, gave them extra attention. But when we asked, the kids insisted it was about tutoring. Carr made a note. Patterns rarely began the day before disaster. They evolved quietly, almost politely, until something snapped. Later that afternoon, Carr met with Rowan's parents in their living room. The house felt suspended in grief. Rowan's mother clutched a tissue she hadn't used, as though afraid to let go of anything. Rowan liked science, her father said hoarsely. He trusted Mr. Mercer. Did Rowan ever mention being uncomfortable? Carr asked carefully. A silence stretched across the room. Then Rowan's mother spoke. 2 weeks ago, Rowan said Mr. Mercer had been asking him to stay after class, said he was helping him with a project. I didn't think anything of it. I thought it meant Rowan was doing well. Carr kept her tone steady. Did Rowan seem upset, withdrawn? He was quieter, the father admitted, but he's 13. Teenagers get quiet. That evening, Carr returned to the station with more questions than answers. The autopsy report arrived just before 6. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. The injury was consistent with impact against a hard surface. The report noted defensive bruising on Rowan's forearms. Carr read the findings twice. Accidental fall seemed less likely now, a struggle inside a classroom built for experiments in lab safety. She requested immediate re-interviews of faculty who had been present during the last period. One teacher, Miss Evelyn Price, mentioned hearing raised voices. I didn't catch words, Price said nervously, twisting her wedding band, but it sounded tense. I assumed it was discipline. Calvin could be strict. How strict? Carr pressed. Price hesitated. He expected obedience, absolute obedience. The next morning, Carr sat across from Calvin Mercer in an interview room. He looked composed, almost offended. This is absurd, Mercer said, folding his hands neatly. Rowan must have tripped. I stepped out to retrieve lab supplies. When I came back, he was on the floor. The medical examiner doesn't believe it was a fall, Carr replied evenly. Mercer's composure flickered, just slightly. Children exaggerate injuries all the time. You're making a tragedy into something sinister. Carr slid a copy photo of the notebook page across the table. Told her not to say anything. If they find out, it's over. What were you referring to? He glanced down, then back up. Personal matters, unrelated. Explain. He shifted in his seat. I was having marital problems, that's all. Carr didn't argue, not yet. Instead, she pivoted. Why were you alone with Rowan for nearly 40 minutes? For tutoring. Without documentation? Without notifying administration? Mercer's jaw tightened. I don't need permission to help a struggling student. Rowan wasn't struggling, Carr said quietly. His grades were solid. A pause. Too long. As Mercer left the room under temporary supervision, Carr reviewed surveillance footage from the hallway outside the classroom. Cameras inside classrooms were prohibited, but the corridor offered partial insight. At 3:12 p.m., Mercer was seen ushering students out. At 3:15, Rowan re-entered. At 4:53, Mercer emerged alone, glancing both ways before walking briskly towards the supply closet. He returned 2 minutes later. At 4:01 p.m., a custodian discovered Rowan inside. The timeline narrowed. The space for coincidence shrank. By Thursday, more students had come forward, quietly at first, then in small clusters. A school counselor reported that 2 8th graders described Mercer as intense and secretive. One claimed Mercer insisted on private project meetings, asking students not to mention them because others wouldn't understand advanced work. Carr saw the pattern crystallizing: isolation, control, silence. But suspicion was not proof. Forensic results from the classroom arrived Friday afternoon. A partial fingerprint matching Mercer's was found at the edge of the lab counter near where Rowan's head had struck. That alone meant little. It was his classroom. More compelling was a faint smear of Rowan's blood on the cuff of Mercer's jacket, recovered from his home under warrant. When confronted with the evidence, Mercer's confidence faltered. "I tried to help him. He was upset. He knocked something over. I grabbed him to steady him." "Steady him hard enough to cause defensive bruises?" Carr asked. Mercer's voice rose. "You don't understand these kids. They lie. They twist everything." Carr watched him closely. Anger can be grief. It can be fear. It can also be exposure. Outside the station, Alder Ridge's quiet veneer was cracking. Social media buzzed with speculation. Parents demanded transparency. The school board scheduled an emergency meeting. Carr drove by West Hollow that evening. The building stood dark now, its windows reflecting the streetlights. She thought about trust, how classrooms were meant to be safe harbors, how easily authority could blur into coercion when no one looked too closely. She returned to her office and drafted a warrant request for Mercer's personal devices. If there had been a pattern of manipulation, digital traces might exist. Messages, emails, something tangible. As she prepared to leave, her phone buzzed. It was the lab. "We found something else," the technician said. "Fibers under Rowan's fingernails. They match the fabric of Mercer's jacket." Carr closed her eyes briefly. The pieces were aligning, but she needed the full picture. Outside, rain began to fall over Alder Ridge, washing sidewalks and rooftops alike. It could not wash what had happened inside that classroom, but it marked a shift. The investigation was no longer circling possibility. It was tightening around a single, uncomfortable truth. And somewhere in town, behind drawn curtains, Calvin Mercer sat alone, aware now that the story he had told was unraveling thread by thread. The rumors moved faster than any official statement ever could. By the time the district attorney announced formal charges against Daniel Mercer, half of Brook Hollow already believed they knew the entire story. They didn't. What they knew were fragments: a respected middle school teacher, a handful of students who felt uneasy, a parent who refused to be dismissed, and a school district that had ignored warning signs for far too long. The investigation deepened over the following weeks. Detectives from the county's Special Victims Unit interviewed dozens of students, past and present. Some had nothing to report. Others described moments that, standing alone, seemed minor, but when placed together, the pattern became clear. Private tutoring sessions behind closed doors, personal text messages sent late at night, small gifts that were never documented, compliments that slowly shifted from academic praise to something more personal and inappropriate. Parents who had once praised Mercer for his dedication now sifted through their own memories. Had there been signs? Field trips he insisted on chaperoning alone, study sessions that ran later than necessary, a habit of positioning himself as the only adult who truly understood struggling kids. It was grooming behavior, investigators said later. Subtle, methodical, intentional. Mercer denied everything. Through his attorney, he issued a carefully worded statement claiming the allegations were exaggerated misunderstandings. He framed himself as a passionate educator targeted by misinterpretations of professional mentorship. He pointed out that no formal complaints had been filed during his 12-year career. He leaned heavily on his previously spotless record. But spotless records can hide stains no one bothered to look for. As the prosecution built its case, the district conducted its own internal audit. Emails were reviewed, security footage from hallways was analyzed, policies were examined. What they found was not just a single man's misconduct, but systemic negligence. Several teachers admitted they had felt uncomfortable with Mercer's closeness to certain students, but assumed administration had vetted him. An assistant principal recalled receiving a vague concern from a parent 2 years earlier, but categorized it as a communication issue. The superintendent acknowledged under oath that staff training on boundaries had not been updated in nearly a decade. The trial began 6 months after the first report. The courtroom in neighboring Grayford County was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, parents filled the benches. Some came seeking justice. Others came hoping the accusations would somehow collapse. The prosecution's case rested heavily on testimony. 3 former students, now older and visibly nervous, described experiences that echoed one another. They spoke of how Mercer singled them out for praise, offered to help with personal problems, gradually blurred the line between teacher and confidant. They described how compliments turned into comments about appearance, how after-school help turned into isolation. There were no graphic details. The prosecutor didn't need them. The pattern was the story. Text messages recovered from Mercer's phone showed boundary violations that were difficult to defend. He had used affectionate language. He had asked students to keep conversations private. He had invited them to meet without notifying parents. While none of the messages were overtly explicit, they painted a clear picture of manipulation. The defense tried to undermine credibility. They suggested the students' misinterpreted tone. They implied parents had influenced accounts. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence. They leaned on Mercer's years of positive performance reviews and letters of recommendation from colleagues. For a moment, it seemed possible the case might fracture under the weight of ambiguity. Then the prosecution introduced testimony from a former student who had transferred out of Brook Hollow 5 years earlier. She had never filed a complaint. She had told no one at the time, but watching the news coverage stirred something she could no longer ignore. Her story mirrored the others almost exactly. Same compliments, same late-night messages, same escalating secrecy. That testimony shifted the atmosphere in the courtroom. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. It was consistency. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When the verdict came, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty on multiple counts of misconduct involving minors. Mercer's face remained expressionless as the verdict was read. His wife wept quietly. Some parents cried in relief. Others stared at the floor, grappling with the realization that someone they had trusted had been something else entirely behind closed doors. Sentencing followed 2 months later. The judge did not mince words. He spoke about betrayal of trust, about the responsibility educators carry, about the lasting harm caused not just to individuals, but to a community's sense of safety. Mercer received a lengthy prison sentence and was permanently barred from teaching in the state. But prison time did not undo the damage. Brook Hollow Middle School underwent sweeping changes. The principal resigned. The superintendent was replaced the following year. New policies were implemented requiring transparent tutoring sessions, mandatory reporting training, and stricter communication guidelines between staff and students. Classroom doors were fitted with larger glass panels. Surveillance procedures were tightened. Parents formed an advocacy group focused on safeguarding reforms. They pushed for independent audits and stronger oversight. They demanded transparency. For the students directly involved, recovery was slower and far more personal. Counseling services were offered, some families relocated, some students struggled with trust in authority figures long after the headlines faded. Trauma does not resolve on a news cycle. Yet something else emerged alongside the pain. Conversations that once had been uncomfortable became necessary. Students learned language around boundaries. Parents became more proactive in asking questions. Teachers received clearer guidance on appropriate conduct. The silence that once protected misconduct began to dissolve. The case forced Brook Hollow to confront an uncomfortable truth. Abuse rarely begins with something obvious. It begins with small boundary shifts that are easy to excuse. A private conversation, a compliment that lingers too long, a request for secrecy framed as trust. It thrives in environments where politeness overrides instinct. Years later, the school looked different, not just structurally, but culturally. There was more oversight, yes, but there was also more openness. Students felt empowered to report concerns without fear of dismissal. Administrators documented complaints with precision. The district partnered with external child advocacy organizations to ensure compliance. The community never fully forgot what happened, nor should they. Daniel Mercer became a cautionary example in educator training seminars statewide. His name was cited not for sensationalism, but as a reminder of how easily authority can be misused when safeguards are weak. For the families involved, justice was imperfect but necessary. It did not erase what had occurred. It did, however, validate the courage it took to speak. And in the end, that courage changed more than a verdict. It changed a system. It proved that even in quiet towns with polished reputations, vigilance matters, that trust must be earned continuously, not assumed permanently, that when a single voice raises concern, it deserves to be heard. Brook Hollow returned to something resembling normalcy. Buses still lined up each morning, students still rushed through hallways, teachers still assigned homework, but beneath that routine lived a hard-earned awareness. Sometimes the most shocking crimes are not the loudest ones. They are the ones that unfold quietly behind classroom doors, masked by professionalism and reputation. And sometimes justice begins not with a dramatic discovery, but with a parent who refuses to look away.